From a sultan who had never lost a single fight in his life, gripping the bars of an iron cage, to a warlord who hadn't tasted defeat in 40 straight years, to an empire that came this close to disappearing completely, less than 100 years after it started. This is the Battle of Ankara explained. A collision so lopsided that the loser's own sons had to fight an 11-year civil war just to stop the whole empire from falling apart for good. But let's rewind. By the year 1400, Sultan Bayezid I was the scariest man in Europe, and he absolutely knew it. Nobody called him just Bayezid, they called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt. He earned that name because the guy moved his army at a speed that shouldn't have been possible for the era. His enemies would be settling in for the season, and suddenly Ottoman cavalry was already on the horizon behind them. In 1396, he obliterated an entire European crusade at a place called Nicopolis, an army stacked with French and Burgundian knights who showed up in shining armor, expecting a quick, glorious win over the Turks. Spoiler alert. It was not quick, and it was not glorious, and most of them didn't go home. The lucky captured knights got ransomed back to their families for a fortune. Several hundred of the unlucky ones got executed the very next morning, just so the rest of Europe understood exactly what kind of man they were now dealing with. And back home in his capital at Bursa, Bayezid was living it up in a court so lavish that visiting ambassadors described it like something out of a dream. Wine, music, a sprawling harem, the whole royal fantasy package. Nice work if you can get it, while a starving city 50 miles away waited for him to finally finish the job. By 1400, Bayezid had Constantinople itself under siege, on and off, for nearly 8 straight years. The last Roman city on earth, starving behind its walls, one bad winter away from falling more than 50 years before it actually did. Bayezid figured he was untouchable, and for a good while there, he basically was. But here's the thing. Way out on the steppes of Central Asia, there was another man who also hadn't lost. Not once. Not in nearly 40 years of constant warfare. His name was Timur. You've probably heard him called Tamerlane. And where Bayezid earned his nickname from speed, Timur earned his from something else entirely. He'd taken an arrow to the leg and hand decades earlier, and it left him with a permanent limp, so his enemies whispered Timur the Lame behind his back, like it was some kind of weakness. Cool. Cool, cool, cool. Except the guy went on to conquer an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean anyway, so the limp clearly wasn't slowing him down much. And here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. When Timur's armies took a city that resisted a little too hard for his liking, he didn't just win. He built towers, out of human skulls, stacked deliberately outside the city gates as a message to the next town thinking about resisting. Isfahan got one. Baghdad got one. This was a man who had made surrender immediately the only rational move on the table for about 3 decades straight. And here's the twist that makes Timur so hard to figure out. The same man who stacked human skulls into pyramids also spent decades forcibly relocating the best architects, scholars, and artists from every city he conquered straight back to his own capital, Samarkand, turning it into one of the most dazzling cities on the planet. He wanted history to remember him as a builder, not just a butcher. Turns out he was terrifyingly good at both. So picture it. 2 men who have never lost a battle in their adult lives. 2 empires that each genuinely believe they're the biggest thing on the map. And in the year 1400, they're on a direct collision course with each other. And the disrespect that lit the fuse came in 3 flavors. Number 1. Territory. Bayezid had been swallowing up a string of small Turkish kingdoms across Anatolia, and several of the rulers he'd deposed ran straight to Timur, begging for protection and revenge. Number 2. Refugees. Timur had a couple of his own enemies running loose out there, and Bayezid was sheltering them, which Timur took as a deeply personal insult. Number 3, and honestly the pettiest one, the letters. These 2 men exchanged actual written correspondence back and forth, each one essentially telling the other, "You are not a real king, and I could crush you by lunchtime." Which, when both of you command armies well over 100,000 strong, is not the kind of trash talk you casually walk back. And this is the part historians love, 'cause the actual letters more or less survive, and they read like 2 men who have never once been told no in their entire lives. Timur, paraphrased, basically wrote back something along the lines of, "You're a minor prince who got lucky a few times. Know your place." Bayezid, who again had also never lost a single battle, was not exactly the type to read that quietly and let it go. Oh boy, here we go. By the summer of 1402, Bayezid had to make a decision nobody in Constantinople saw coming. He broke the siege. The thing he had spent almost a decade grinding toward, the conquest that would have made him the man who finally finished off the Roman Empire, and he walked away from it to march his army toward Ankara instead. Because as terrifying as a starving city full of desperate Romans was, an approaching horde of over 100,000 steppe warriors was scarier still. And this is the part historians always skip over. Timur didn't just outnumber Bayezid, he outthought him before a single arrow was fired. Timur's forces reached the region first, and he did something almost embarrassingly simple and brutal. He poisoned and diverted the water sources feeding the plain around Ankara. So when Bayezid's army, somewhere around 85,000 men against Timur's roughly 140,000, finally arrived after a brutal forced march through the middle of an Anatolian summer, they weren't just outnumbered. They were dehydrated, cooking alive in their own armor, fighting for water before they had even swung a single sword in anger. And keep in mind, this was the peak of an Anatolian summer. No shade for miles, no relief, men and horses collapsing from heat before the battle had even officially begun. Some things about war, it turns out, never change. But that's nothing compared to what happens once the actual fighting starts. On July 20th, 1402, the two armies finally collided on the plain outside Ankara, and almost immediately the battle turned into one of the most brutal betrayals in military history. See, a huge chunk of Bayezid's army wasn't really loyal to him at all. They were Anatolian Turco-Mongol cavalry, soldiers pulled from those small kingdoms Bayezid had personally conquered and annexed just years earlier. And when they looked across the battlefield and saw Timur standing there, the same man who had been sheltering their old deposed rulers this entire time, they didn't fight for Bayezid. They switched sides, mid-battle, in full view of the entire army. Wait, why would anyone stick around after watching that unfold right in front of them? Well, some did. Bayezid's brother-in-law, a Serbian prince named Stefan Lazarević, commanded a unit of heavily armored cavalry, and unlike half the army melting away around him in real time, Stefan and his men held their line. They fought like it was the very last thing they would ever do, cutting a bloody path toward Bayezid himself, desperately trying to get their sultan out alive, while everything around them collapsed. And for one brief moment, it almost worked. Almost. Remember that cage from the thumbnail? We are about 2 minutes away from it. Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, the man who had never once lost a battle in his entire life, was surrounded, cut off from what remained of his loyal troops, and captured alive. He became the only Ottoman Sultan in the entire 600-year history of the empire to ever be taken prisoner on a battlefield. Number one Sultan, number one loss. Nobody saw it coming. By the time the dust settled over that plain, tens of thousands of men lay dead, and Bayezid's entire command structure had evaporated in a single afternoon. And here's where the story tips over into legend, in the most literal sense of the word. Later chroniclers, and one very dramatic English playwright writing almost 200 years afterward, claimed that Timur paraded Bayezid around in an actual iron cage, humiliating him in front of foreign envoys, even supposedly using him as a human footstool to mount his horse. And here's the part historians still argue about today. Nobody can fully confirm the cage. Some say it's real. Some say it's later propaganda dramatized for maximum shock value, the medieval version of a viral rumor. But what nobody disputes, cage or no cage, is this. Bayezid was captured, humiliated, and never went home again. He died in captivity 8 months later, in March of 1403. Some accounts say illness finally took him. Others say he chose to end his own life rather than live another day as somebody else's trophy. So who do you actually blame for this? Bayezid's own arrogance for picking a fight with a man who had never lost? Or the vassals who sold him out the second things got difficult? Drop your verdict in the comments, because I genuinely want to hear the argument. But wait, there's more, and this is the part that made the whole disaster matter for the next 100 years of history. With Bayezid gone, the Ottoman Empire didn't just stumble, it very nearly collapsed completely. His 4 sons, Suleiman, Musa, Isa, and Mehmed, tore the empire apart fighting each other for the throne in a brutal 11-year civil war historians now call the Ottoman Interregnum. 4 brothers, 1 throne, and roughly a decade of backstabbing that would make a modern prestige drama writer take notes. Musa eventually had his own brother Isa strangled to secure his claim. Mehmed later had Musa executed too. Spoiler alert, none of these family reunions ended well. The empire that had terrified all of Europe just years earlier shrank down to basically one city and prayed it would survive its own royal family. It took until 1413 for one surviving son, Mehmed I, to finally reunify what little was left and drag the empire back from the edge. And if that whole undefeated conqueror falls and his empire immediately tears itself apart pattern sounds familiar, it should. We told you almost the exact same story happened to Alexander the Great, 17 centuries earlier. Some patterns in history just refuse to die. And here's the modern echo that actually matters. Constantinople, the city Bayezid had been one hard push away from finally conquering, got handed an extra 50 years of life it never should have had. The Byzantine emperor watching from behind those walls, a man named Manuel II, went from expecting certain doom to suddenly, unbelievably, getting a reprieve nobody had planned for. He'd spent years touring the courts of Western Europe, personally begging kings and popes for help that never really came. And then, out of nowhere, a warlord from the other side of the known world did the job for him without even meaning to. If you watched our video on the night a 21-year-old ended the Roman Empire forever, that ending happens in 1453. And if this one single battle outside Ankara had gone the other way, that ending might have come 50 years earlier, under a completely different sultan, in a completely different version of history. One battle, one afternoon of betrayal and dehydration on a dusty plain outside Ankara, and an empire that should have collapsed for good instead got a second chance it barely deserved. Timur, meanwhile, just kept walking. He turned his army east, setting his sights on an invasion of Ming China next, because apparently conquering everything from India to Anatolia in a single lifetime wasn't quite enough for him. He never made it. He died on the road in February of 1405, still undefeated, still feared across 3 continents, right up to his very last day. And in a twist he probably would have appreciated, his own massive empire started fracturing among his grandsons almost the moment he was in the ground. Proof that even the guy who humiliated an empire couldn't outrun the same fate himself forever. And that's where things get genuinely interesting. Because history has this brutal habit of humbling the one guy who thinks he's already won. Bayezid believed Constantinople was his for the taking, that the real threat in the world was a starving, crumbling Roman city he had already surrounded for 8 straight years. Turns out the real threat wasn't behind those walls at all. It was the man he'd never even bothered to take seriously, coming from a completely different direction, with a grudge he never saw building. Funny how that keeps happening throughout history. The empire staring so hard at the enemy in front of it that it never checks what's creeping up from behind. Ask yourself this: if 2 of the most powerful men on the entire planet were just one exchange of insulting letters away from a war that reshaped an empire, how many so-called untouchable powers today are one bad decision away from finding out they weren't as untouchable as they thought? So one more time, who do you blame for Ankara? Bayezid's ego for starting a fight he didn't need to start, or the vassals who abandoned him the moment it got hard? Drop your verdict below, and defend it, cause I will absolutely be arguing back in the replies. And if you think one overconfident empire meeting its match was something to see, wait until you hear about the empire that marched onto a continent completely convinced nobody there could touch them, and got their entire military reputation shattered in a single afternoon by warriors they never once bothered to take seriously. Click this video right here.